Let's begin with something simple. We're going to see how to work with existing files. Now, the file class provides some features for working with files, and as I mentioned earlier, most of the methods in this class are static. You call them directly on the file object, and if you're not familiar with static classes, you should go back and watch the section on classes to find out what a static class is. So the file object provides some really useful functions. I'm going to go over some of them here, not all of them because there's quite a few. But for example, there's an exists method that checks to see if a file at a given path exists or not. And if a file does not exist, you can call a method called create, which surprisingly creates the file at the specified path. There's also functions for copying and moving and deleting files. There's file.copy, which copies a file to another location. There's a move function, which, as the name indicates, moves a file. And there's a delete function, which deletes a file at a specified path. So let's jump over to the code and exercise some of these functions and see how they work. Okay, so I'm here in my existing project with my program file open, and here's my snippets. And I've scrolled down to the existing files section. So let's begin by just checking to see if a file exists. And what I'm going to do is use a couple of other utilities to get a path to a special location here on my computer. So we're going to be working with files in the My Documents folder, and I'm going to copy these first few lines right here. So let's take a quick review of these lines of code before we do anything else. So the first few lines, I have a Boolean variable called file exists, and I initialize it to false because we're going to assume that the file doesn't exist. Then we need to build up a file path, and the path just basically specifies where on the computer the file exists or not. So here I'm going to say I have a string called the path, and I'm going to use a special .NET class called the environment class. The environment class gives me some utilities for working with the Windows environment. So I'm going to ask the environment to get me a folder path. And the getFolderPath function can take a couple of different arguments. I'm going to use the environment.specialfolder.myDocuments property, and this will get me a path to the My Documents folder on this computer. Now, I could have just hard-coded this by typing in, C:\users/Joe Marini, so on and so forth. That's really not a very good practice. You don't want to hard-code things into your applications if you can avoid it. And Windows, and in this case .NET, provides a bunch of utilities for working with special document folders. Not just My Documents, but things like the temporary directory and the trash or the recycle bin, that kind of thing. So I'm using this environment class right here to get the path to the My Documents folder. So once I have the path to the My Documents folder, I'm then going to add on to the end this string right here, which is testfile.txt. And recall, I put the @ sign at the front of the string to prevent this \t here from being treated as a tab character. I want the / to actually be treated as a path separator. So at the end of all this, I'll have a full path to a file named testfile.txt. All right, let's go bring up my Documents folder so you can see what's in it. Okay, this is the My Documents folder. And you can see that right now there is no file named testfile.txt in here. So we're going to create it if it doesn't exist. Let's go back to the code. We start off by using the file.exists function here on line 17. So we call file.exists, and that returns a Boolean result indicating whether or not the file exists. And then I have an if statement. And my if statement says if the file exists, then just write out to the console that the file exists. Otherwise, write out that the file does not exist and we're going to create it. Then we call the file.create function with the path, and this will create the file for us. So let's go ahead and see what happens when we build and run this. The code compiles and runs, and you can see that we're getting a message out to the console that says the file does not exist, creating it. So let's go back to our My Documents folder. And you can see now that the test file has been created. And in this case, I'm hiding known file extensions, so you don't see the .txt on the end there, but it is there. Okay, so test file has now been created, and let's go back and do some more work with it. Let's go back to the snippets. And we'll copy this over. Copy, and we'll paste this in. Okay, so I'm going to comment out these last two lines just for a moment. So once we've determined that the file exists, we can then get some information about it. In this particular section of the code here, I'm saying if the file exists, then let's figure out when it was created. And we're going to use the file's getCreationTime method and the getLastAccessTime method for the file. And we pass in the file path both times to get information about the file. And this will tell us when the file was created and when it was last accessed. Okay, so now when I run the program again, the file already exists. So this part of the if statement should execute and we shouldn't have to recreate it. So I'm going to save and I'm going to run. And sure enough, you can see that I'm getting the message the file exists. So we didn't have to recreate it. And you can see it was created on such and such a date at such and such a time. And it was last accessed on such and such a date and such a time. Let's finish up our exercise by moving the file to a new location. So I'm going to hit return and exit out of that. Now I'm going to uncomment these last two lines here. And we're going to move the file somewhere else using the file.move function. And what we're going to do is move the file from its existing path, that's the first argument, to the path, but we're just going to give it a new name. So it's going to stay in the same folder, but it's going to be renamed to newfile.txt. So we're going to save, and we're going to run. And you can see that we're still getting the original message that it exists and the creation and access times. And now we are moving the file. So let's go back to the My Documents folder. And you can see that test file is no longer there. It is now called new file. So you can use these functions to operate on files that are existing or create new ones on your file system. And if you feel like getting a little bit more advanced, go take a look at the file class. There's a whole bunch of other useful methods in there that you can experiment with for working with existing files.